Welcome all to the National WIC Association and Thousand Days panel on Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander breastfeeding for National Breastfeeding Month. My name is Darlena Birch, Senior Manager of Public Health Nutrition for the National WIC Association. Today, we engage in a much-needed conversation around health equity within the AANHPI community, specifically the inequities and systemic barriers that limit AANHPI women's access to and participation in breastfeeding. Currently, the lack of data collection for AANHPI mothers on the federal level directly contributes to the health disparities our community faces. So we're going to address some of these concerns head on today and talk about potential solutions programs and communities can take to mitigate these barriers. So follow NWA and Thousand Days to stay posted on all the upcoming events for National Breastfeeding Month. With that, I'm excited for you to meet our esteemed panelists. First, Wendy Fong.
Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here with you today. I am a registered dietitian and a lactation consultant that work with many Asian families within Southern California. I work with the Public Health Foundation Enterprise, PHFE WIC, in Southern California. It's a program of Haluna Health. It's nice to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. And Pauline Sakamoto.
Hello, everyone. I'm Pauline Sakamoto, and I'm a nurse, a master's degree public health nurse. And I've worked in various public health jobs all my life, literally. But my last really important work was for over 20 years, I was the executive director of the San Jose Mothers Milk Bank, which is a nonprofit, the oldest milk bank in the United States, and one of the largest distributing milk banks as well. And I was employed as a director, and now I'm a consultant for the milk bank in operations and regulations. I'm also part of the collaboration called the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders Lactation Collaboration of California. And we're fairly new, but it's a really incredible opportunity for us as Asian Americans to come together that have an interest in lactation and share ideas and efforts that are going on in California for the vast variety of communities that we have. So I'm very pleased to be here and working with Wendy on this because she's got a lot of experience as well. Thank you, Darlena.
Thank you so much, Pauline. So thank you, Wendy and Pauline, for telling us a little bit about your work and the organizations you represent. Could you tell me why this work is important for you? And let's start with Wendy.
Sure. So as a mom who have breastfeed 2 children, while I was breastfeeding my children, I encountered some concerns from the community. When I breastfeed out in the public, they look at me interestingly, or when I breastfeed in a restaurant, other family would be like, what is she doing? So it is very important to me to support my community, to let my community know that Asian families do breastfeed. Oftentimes, we just need to be out there and talk about it and make a norm, normalizing breastfeeding within the Asian community. We need the support, and we need our community support as well.
Thanks, Wendy. Pauline?
Yeah, I was a breastfeeding mom too, many, many moons ago, and also a volunteer donor to the milk bank, and that's how I got involved. During my generation, not very many of us actually breastfed. I mean, it was just kind of the idea of that, our importance as being women in work. And so, formula was the way to go and not particularly breastfeed. Definitely what I see in my work with the Human Milk Banking Association and with our milk bank is that there are very limited languages that we share information about breastfeeding. And it doesn't matter whether it's the Asian American population or the African American or even Latinx population. If we can't provide the information in their cultural ramifications in their community and work with the community leaders, and provide the information in the languages that they're most comfortable. Breastfeeding doesn't become a real high priority because they see the Western culture um, it manifests itself with formula use. So it's really important for me to be part of this action and activity to move the agenda because it's just we all know, and it's not new news, right? I mean, WIC has been so great about it that breastfeeding, obviously, the breast milk is so much more important than formula. But I think the other thing now, just currently, is the fact that we've had this formula crisis. And we've got these women who are trying their darndest to feed their infants. And how could we support these women from early on, from day one, to help them to at least get some feeling of success with breastfeeding? And that's why I do this work and work with my collaborators in the various languages and community groups. And because to me, it's very important. We want successful breastfeeders. WIC wants successful breastfeeders. We all want to be successful breastfeeders. And I mean, I can tell you my story, and I wasn't so successful the first 3 months, but I stuck it out. And that's what I want to share with people, is that we really need to move this agenda along.
Thank you so much for that, Wendy and Pauline. I want to piggyback off something you just mentioned. Pauline, you mentioned the infant formula crisis. And I know when you're doing your introduction, you mentioned the milk bank. So we know in WIC that it doesn't support donor milk, but I wanted to get some insights from your perspective on ways in which, even though WIC doesn't provide donor milk to participants, what are ways that we as a community can support donor milk, especially given the current infant formula crisis?
Well, I'll tell you, it has been an interesting, dynamic situation since the beginning of the year. And it, surprisingly, even with the government, federal government support, it's still a problem, right? It's still a problem for our moms and for the WIC community. And in California, I know that the state WIC office is trying their darndest to keep them afloat. For our milk bank in San Jose, I can just tell you, just numbers wise, the demand for milk went up about 20%. And in looking at the requests for milk, some of them are WIC, participants, and they're on Medicaid. And so we know that they're having a horrible time. So the milk banking industry, or the Human Milk Banking Association of North America, which there are 31 nonprofit milk banks in North America, and -3 of those are in the United States. And we service all 50 states. California's milk bank services Hawaii and Nevada and some of the other states that we're surrounded by. We try our darndest to find milk, and the WIC offices in California have been superb in helping us try to find the volunteer donors. In the meantime, I feel like it's our responsibility to make sure that we have access for all families to donor milk. So we are providing milk to some of the moms who just are having a horrible time. And, we know the story. We know the ones that are on the poverty level. Just to drive and get the formula and then to go to the store and not find it and go to the next store is horrific. It should not happen. It should have never happened with the formula companies, right? So we're doing our darndest to keep the supply out.
Thank you so much, Pauline. And Wendy, I wanted to piggyback off something you mentioned earlier with your own breastfeeding experience. So what are some of the stigmas that you feel like the Asian community maybe faces with breastfeeding, and even with accessing WIC? What are some of those barriers that you feel like a lot of, members in our community face?
Definitely. So one of the stigma regarding to Asian family applying to WIC is the public charge. When the public charge the news first rolled out 2 years ago, that driven a lot of fear, a lot of nervousness, a lot of different negative emotion toward applying for WIC. Even though there has been news coming out from NWA, the state level California WIC, to share with the community that WIC is not public charge. However, we still could hear or see families who share with us like, oh, I don't want to apply for WIC because of the public charge concern. So currently at PHIV WIC level, at the local agency level, that is one of the priority message we share with the families, the community, is WIC is not public charge. WIC is here to help you to raise your family, to have a healthy start for your family and for the community. And regarding to my personal level of breastfeeding stigma, oftentimes one of the stigma is that we shouldn't be breastfeeding in the public. If it's breastfeeding, go into a door, go inside to hide and breastfeed. You should not breastfeed in public. And second stigma that I experience a lot is people often say, you don't have enough milk. You don't have enough milk. I am a 5'2", so oftentimes my uncles or aunts or grandparents, the in-law will say, can you produce enough milk? They put the size to the quantity. But oftentimes we need to tell our moms that size does not matter. It doesn't matter if you eat a lot, if you don't eat as much, or you follow certain diet. That will not affect your milk supply. The quantity comes with the demand. So that's one of the priority message I talk to my Asian family at WIC is the demand and supply.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Wendy. And I can relate to that because my mom's Chinese. She's from Hong Kong, and she used to be 5'1". She's gotten a little smaller over the years. But I was actually formula fed. And when I once asked her why, she said because she didn't produce enough milk. And I didn't say anything because I know that, she did the best that she could with her infant feeding decisions. But in my mind, having worked in WIC, I understood that maybe it was just that she didn't have the support that she needed to be able to breastfeed us, but she was also a full-time working mom, very career oriented. So there was a lot of barriers for her and her own experience in terms of choosing how to breastfeed her own children. So thank you. I find that answer very relatable. And I think a lot of the attendees watching this live stream will too. So the next question I want to ask is, nationally, breastfeeding rates have increased from 42% in 1998 to 71% in 2016. What contribution do you believe WIC has contributed to this increase in the breastfeeding rate?
So I could start. I would say the primary contribution from WIC is the prenatal educations. I have worked for WIC in the past 6 years. The numerous prenatal educations, prenatal topics, talking points that we have implemented into our prenatal families has been growing as the years are, moving on. So definitely the prenatal education, we all know without a great prenatal education or exposure to the family about the benefits of breastfeeding, that will not lead us to such a great increase in the past 15 to 20 years.
Mm-hmm. I also think that the WIC has been very active that I know of, and again, working with specific communities that have language differences or different languages, for example, and maybe different cultural ideas. I know that our collaboration, we talk quite a bit. We all get together and eat together. And we always have food with, it starts with rice. So we're but I mean, it's really interesting that, that we're able to compare information culturally. What is it that binds the Asian American and the Native Hawaiian and the Pacific Islanders? What are the similarities that we can attach to the education of lactation so that it would be more meaningful? And also to be able to find those community leaders in those specific communities that could support us in getting lactation going. I think that, for me, just looking from the outside, because I haven't worked with WIC, although at one point of time my milk bank was in a WIC office. But looking from the outside, I think that the fact that WIC has been such a forefront in California and in really starting the conversation and changing the ways that they've impart why breastfeeding is so important, even with the food, coupons or whatever, credit card, whatever is provided, that we've changed that mantra. And I think that we should go even further in a lot of ways. But anyways, I think that WIC has been a starter. And I think for a lot of hospitals that are beginning to understand the importance of breastfeeding, it's just kind of keeps going, right, in the different environments. So I'm happy with it. Our milk bank we've been lactation work starting from day one. I mean, we can't do what we do if mothers weren't breastfeeding, right? So it's important to us that moms breastfeed.
Absolutely. Wendy, did you have something to add, or?
Yes, I do. Thank you. So one thing that I forgot to mention is that WIC has been, in the past few years, has been driving toward more health equity. We are hiring more lactation staff, more staff that work for WIC that come from different background, different ethnicity. When our clients are receiving perhaps a breastfeeding education from someone who have the same skin tone, same look as them, it's more easily accepted, received within themselves. And also the language. As Pauline earlier mentioned, oftentimes, if you Google breastfeeding education out there in Chinese, there might be very limited that you can find. There are a lot of resources that I found from Canada, Australia, but within California, we might not have as many of the breastfeeding education in our own languages. So having the staff who speaks the language, who does the education, that will definitely build a better linkage and better support with our families to encourage them to breastfeed.
Thank you for that, Wendy. And I actually think that's a good segue into our next question because, at the National WIC Association as well, we're looking into ways in which we can diversify the WIC workforce, from both the breastfeeding perspective and nutrition perspective. So what are ways in which you believe WIC needs to, work harder to close the gap in breastfeeding rates, particularly among communities of color? You briefly discussed, like having materials in languages that the populations can read, having, breastfeeding staff that look like and have the same cultural background as the WIC participants receiving the counseling and education. Is there anything else that we haven't discussed yet that you think can help with closing this gap in breastfeeding rates?
I think one of the things clearly in the United States that we really need to work on is the duration of breastfeeding. And I would hope that WIC really approaches that in a really incredible way. And again, like Wendy was suggesting, to develop a program to help moms not only to start them breastfeeding, but for the existence of what the AAP just came out with 2 years now, that the policy is now to breastfeed up to 2 years is optional, is optimal. It's not optional, it's optimal. So, I think that, again, that ability to have somebody in the community or somebody that looks like them who can speak the language, who understands the cultural differences, like the types of food you have to eat in order to, be able to successfully, quote, breastfeed, even though it's not within the Western culture. I think it still is important that those of us who are in lactation understand that. We've heard stories, and I'm sure Wendy knows, stories where women of a Chinese background, were given yogurt and cold water to drink after they deliver, which is totally not appropriate. And I'm sure if their mothers and mother-in-laws were in that room, they would have an absolute blowout, right? The mother wouldn't have any nutrition or any fluids. So those are the kinds of things that I think that we have to be very cognizant about. And also, there are 83 different languages in the Asian population, which there's probably more different cultural dynamics going on with birth. And I think that we know in the Western culture what we feel is important in birth and lactation. But I think we need to honor their past cultural backgrounds that are not safety issues, but clearly would support a mom to successful breastfeeding, right? So I see WIC, and I'm hoping WIC goes to that level. We're now looking at, we need to get these moms past 2 weeks or a month of breastfeeding. And if anything, if this formula crisis showed us anything, right? Anything, this is it, that we've neglected the fact of getting these moms to breastfeed for duration.
Yes, exactly. Thank you for raising that, Pauline and Wendy. I think that also kind of ties into this next question I want to ask, which is how does culture impact breastfeeding practices? So, Pauline, I know you touched on it a little bit for Chinese moms who recently delivered, being given like yogurt and water is like a massive no-no post-delivery for breastfeeding. So, what are other cultural practices that you've seen that impact breastfeeding practices within the AANHPI community?
Oh boy, there's a food is one of them. I mean, our collab is really into food. So food is one of them, right? The different types of foods. I think the other thing is, gosh, we want to impart that the mother and baby should stay together. That's the Western culture. And in some respects, that's Asian too, but there are other issues as well. In certain populations, it's the grandmother that's supposed to take the lead. So we really want to, have that conversation with grandma and the husband or the partner that this is not just mom and baby, that we have to include the family as well. And I think that would be important. I'm a third generation Japanese American. So I was born in California. My parents were born in California. My grandparents immigrated from Japan. So do I know some of the Japanese foods? And you betcha. I mean, even at third generation, And also, but yet we had issues I had issues with my mom who said, you don't have enough milk. And I'm thinking, like, where do you get that? Right. And because she was taught to formula feed during the war, she was taught to formula feed. So she had no clue about breastfeeding and couldn't impart anything. So we don't want people to say, oh, you're Japanese, so you do this, right? Because it may be a Japanese person who doesn't follow the culture and wants something else, or families that are of mixed cultural backgrounds. And so it's an interesting situation because the Asian American and Native Hawaiian and the Pacific Islander population, yes, we do have our uniqueness, but we also have multitudes of backgrounds and cultures and generational that happens. So hopefully that the WIC folks, understand that and take into consideration where that mom is coming from.
I also want to piggyback on what Pauline just said, the baby mommy separation early on. Oftentimes, coming from a Chinese community background, my mother-in-law will say, oh, I can take care of the baby. I will watch the baby for you. You need to rest. You need to take care. You need to recover for yourself. But oftentimes, they coming from a very good heart and for doing that. However, they're literally taking the baby away from me in order for me to breastfeed. And when it's time to feed, they might not recognize the cues. They might not recognize the baby cues that I was taught or I teach a WIC program, that they didn't recognize it. And they think, oh, baby's crying because of X, Y, and Z. Or, oh, baby's crying. Mommy doesn't have milk. Mommy's resting. Let me give you a bottle of filler. Then I'll be very frustrated with that when it happens. But a mommy-baby separation is one of the culture that many Asian community that practice because the older generation think the mom need to recover. They are coming from a good heart. The mom need to recover from the long labor. But that could heavily impact her breastfeeding journey.
Yeah, it's an excellent point that you raised. And I know you previously, I believe Pauline mentioned that there's 83 languages across like the Asian community. And so we know that at USDA, a lot of the federal tracking for race, it is most often just Asian. You check the box Asian. So what are some of the challenges you see in this when we're pulling data together and lumping all Asian communities together? What do you think some of the challenges and consequences are of not trying to really break down that demographic into clearer subsets to get a better idea of what's going on within this community?
Well, I think, doing the research and looking at CDC and the federal, data on breastfeeding, it's very clear to us, when you don't include California's data on Asian Pacific Islanders, you kind of lost 30% of the Asian American Pacific Islanders, Native Hawaiians population right there. So we look stellar in the CDC and the national data. Asians look very stellar in their breastfeeding rates, but those that are on the ground that are working in lactation, it doesn't matter which state, whether it's Louisiana or California or anywhere. We know the pockets of population that, number one, may not be part of WIC and so are not counted. But clearly their breastfeeding rates are worse or even below what is happening. We know pockets in San Francisco of the Chinese population that their breastfeeding rates are lower than the African American population. And also the Pacific Islanders typically, unfortunately, there's services that they're provided are extremely poor. And they live in areas that are in poverty, literally, but they can't get the service. They can't get WIC. They can't get actually into the program, right? That's available to them. So we know that their mortality rate for their infants and moms are high in California. And, we take a step back and think, gosh, we're in the United States, we're in California. How is that happening? Why is that happening? It shouldn't be happening here. But in fact, we're beginning to see that. So the data is really, really important. Even California, we have not disaggregated data. So, the Chinese and Korean population, we look pretty good in our breastfeeding rates. But if you look, and the East Indian as well. But if you look at other, ethnic backgrounds, you'll find pockets that are just very, very poor. And so the data is so important. And it's not just, quote, Asians, right? We've got to disaggregate it so we know really to have the biggest impact for public health.
Thank you. And then I just wanted to make sure I understood. Did you say that California's data isn't included in CDC's numbers, or was
it's not?
Oh, wow.
There's 3 states that are not included, and which is unfortunate. Hopefully the next time around we will be, and our collaboration is really pushing to disaggregate the data. So we can really see where the need is, really.
Do we know why it's not included? There's just such a large population of Asian people.
Yeah. I suspect that for whatever reasons, whatever administration reason, I don't think there was anything that was, dismissed, or I think it was more of an administrative, maybe connection or computer, whatever, I suspect. But certainly it is seen and there's a lot of activity to advocate to include California and for California to disaggregate our data for the Asian American, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders in California so that we know. And to some extent, there is some data coming out right now. So we're excited about that.
Thanks for that, Pauline. So I think, Wendy, I'm going to start you off with our next question. So when you're counseling WIC participants, what are some of the benefits of breastfeeding that you make sure to emphasize while working with them?
So one of the benefits I talk a lot about with my family is the colostrum. Colostrum, oftentimes I find that they don't understand the benefits of colostrum and why colostrum is in a small quantity. Oftentimes, my WIC client would expect they have a full milk volume on day one after a baby is born, or they should be experiencing a very engorged breast on day one. So I make sure I share with them at their last trimester that colostrum, 1 drop of colostrum, 3 drops of colostrum is all your baby needs per feeding at the first few days of life. Don't expect your breast will be engorged like a little, I don't know, engorged to so full on first week of life. In order for you to build up your milk supply, I remind them about the demand and supply. The more demanding by either hand expressions, early latch on within the first hour, or pumping to stimulate the milk volume to increase. If the baby has to be separated for whatever reason, I make sure to tell them, remind them, colostrum is all your baby needs. It has all the good antibodies. Please keep up with feeding the colostrum until your milk volume increases. Usually it will happen by the end of first week of baby's life. So that's the key point takeaway that I want all my WIC families to understand.
Thank you for that, Wendy. Pauline, do you have anything to add?
No, I think that's a really important point Wendy made. And I think the other thing is that a lot of times we hear like there's no milk, like, they're struggling, there's no milk. And I always remind the moms, well, how big do you think their stomachs are? It's not the size of that formula bottle. So, take into account that the baby takes in the size of their stomach, literally, and they're satiated early on. So they don't need to finish that whole 4 ounces of formula, or that your milk that comes out doesn't have to be equivalent to the 4 ounces of that formula bottle. You'll know. And I think the biggest thing that for any population is that, we want the moms to feel successful. And, I don't want to see a generation of moms that feel like they failed. They failed because whatever reason, they felt that they failed at breastfeeding, so they stopped. And I think that we really need to work on that for moms. I mean, young mothers today have enough problems. I mean, we had issues about maternity leave and, all the other stuff that's going on. And it's so disappointing for me, having worked on that stuff on the 70s and 80s, really pushing that stuff to move forward, and then having to come back and, going through and just going, oh God, here we go again, right, kind of thing. So I'm glad that Wendy and her constituent, her peers are out there just saying, Mom, you do the best you can. And we'll give you it will impart some education to you that we know that is truth, and that will support you. We'll support you as much as possible, because we know that you want to do the best for your baby. We know that. So I think that's important. And if we can, if they have extra, like if they're engorged, I mean, Wendy knows. Well, tell the mom to call the milk bank because she can always help her neighbor's baby. I mean, nobody ever wants a NICU baby, right? Nobody wants a preemie. So as a community of mothers and women, we need to support these moms as well, the best we can to support their babies. So yeah, that's what I've got to say.
Thank you so much for that, Pauline and Wendy. So kind of taking a step back and looking at the broader picture outside of WIC, and I know we've kind of discussed some of these factors. How are systemic inequities affecting breastfeeding and attitudes about breastfeeding in the AANHPI community?
Wow, that's a big question. The systemic, I think that, it's just like any other ethnic background. I think that the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders group, we're so diversified that it's very difficult to find that one voice. And, I've been with the U.S. Breastfeeding Committee now for, gosh, I don't know. I was on the board for 9 years, and it's been a long time. But, I see what the African Americans and the Latinx have done. And the Asian Americans have never been been able to get their voice out, right? And we to me, we're so diversified, we kind of go into our own little boxes and try to get the word out. So I think that now the time is right, that there's a group of us that really decided that this is no longer acceptable, that we have a voice as well, and we have stories to tell, and we know the communities that really need help, very similar to the other groups. And we should be able to modify that help for, quote, the biggest bang for the buck, right? So my hope is right now for the infrastructure that we have in healthcare, that they're listening, and they would approach it with not that they know, but to work within the communities and the folks that live there. What is it that they need in order to make sure their morbidity rate goes down? What is it that is success for that community? So that's my hope, that our voices will start being heard, and that we're able to establish change and sustainability in these communities.
Thanks, Pauline. I don't know if you had any thoughts, Wendy.
I just second everything that Pauline just mentioned. It's just that they need to hear us. Voices are being brought up from different community. This is not just for the AANHPI committee. It's all race and ethnicity, the minorities within the United States. Raise your voice so it could be heard, hoping for some implementations that will happen.
Okay, great. Thank you. So I would like to ask one final question before we do some closing remarks. And I'm just scanning the list of questions to find the one that I think is the most interesting. Okay, here's one that we haven't really discussed yet. What should workplaces be doing to become more accommodating for breastfeeding mothers, and why is this important? Because I know we mentioned, how like there's a strong work ethic in Asian culture, how, some of our moms were working, and so it really limited their capacity to breastfeed. So what are some things that you think should be done in the workplace to accommodate breastfeeding, and why is that important?
So I would like to take a step at it first, if that's okay. Lactation accommodation, it is so important. As Darlena, you mentioned, women, Asian Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian women going back to work soon after delivery. I think that having lactation accommodation at every employer is so important. When I look at the law, it mentions something. If the employer has more than a certain number of staff, then it's required for them to have lactation accommodation. What about our aunt? What about my aunt who work for a very small supermarket, a very small restaurant? They only have 10 staff. Can they also be required to have lactation accommodations? Not just the employer who has 100 staff, 600 staff, but we are also talking about those employer who also serve our community, the little supermarkets down the street, the little restaurants. Those women also need our support with their breastfeeding journey. With the WIC client that I serve in Southern California, when I asked about what's your plan when you go back to work, since you are currently breastfeeding, she said, I will have to do combo feeding because there's no place for me to pump my milk other than the bathroom. That's not acceptable. Like, that's something that I really want to push toward, or hoping more legislations will happen, is lactation accommodations across the board. It doesn't matter how many employees this employer has.
Thank you for that, Wendy. Pauline, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, employers, there are so many toolkits for employers on what to do. And I was an employer for 20 years at the milk bank, and we're I mean, yes, it's, as an employer, sometimes it is a problem. I mean, you have to find a space for the mom, and you have to give them the time away. But you know what? In the long run, I mean, we have to tell employers, you want to keep your good employees. You don't want them to leave because they need to breastfeed for really I mean, we're not talking 18 years here. They don't need to breastfeed for 18 years. They only, and so I think that we need to be much more aggressive in getting employers to give moms the time and place. And I can tell you, just from the population working with donors to the milk bank, these are successful women who are pumping at work and making it happen and having excess milk. And I wish there was a way we can share their stories, because we're talking about women who are firemen, fire people, who rigged up. She showed me, she made a picture of it, and I love it. This was about 10 years ago. And she's in the firehouse, but they rigged up her space so she can pump and provide the milk to her child, as well as pump for the milk bank. I mean, we have farm workers in Central Cal that the employers have little tents that the moms can pump in when they need to pump. This is doable. We have to make breastfeeding and pumping the norm in this country. It is the norm if we want the next generation to be healthy. And we need to tell employers, if you want the next generation to be smarter and to be able to accommodate the work that you're doing, this is preventative medicine. This is so preventative medicine. So give that mom the time and space to pump and provide that child human milk, because in the long run, the health services will benefit with the decreased costs of healthcare in this country. I mean, in the long run, there is a lot of benefit to the mother and child, and to the employer, and to the economics and the finance of this country. And so we need to keep that in mind, why it is so important. And so to let the employer know that this is not something that is not a benefit to you. This is a benefit to you. And you have to understand what you're doing. It's preventative health. It is a benefit to you. And I think that's, we need to really advocate that way to the employers. I don't care if it's McDonald's. There is a way to provide the employee a space and time to breastfeed, because you don't want to have that person leave. and you'd have so many months of training to go through for the next person.
Yes, excellent points, Wendy and Pauline. So I would like to give each of you some time to give some final remarks, anything that you want to bring to the forefront that we didn't have a chance to discuss, or anything you'd like to highlight. So Wendy, let's start with you. Do you have any final remarks?
I just want to say that thank you for having me here, be part of this great panel, but also that we are calling you all to support our minorities, our AANHPI communities to breastfeed, not just having lactation accommodations, but the hospitals, the medical clinics, the medical providers to share the same message, to share the same prenatal breastfeeding education message like WIC. If you don't have the resource out there, look for resource from NWA, National WIC Association, or California WIC Association, or even reach out to your local agencies within your neighborhood to reach out and see how you can be on board with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wendy. Pauline?
Yeah, thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this conversation. Of course, Wendy, I just adore Wendy. She's doing a great job in Southern Cal. And the WIC offices have been doing really a great job. I want them to know that there are communities of Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders that want to reach out to WIC and to support the population that they're serving. Whether that our Lactation Collaboration California, whether it means that we need to do a one-on-one with their recipient, or whether they have any questions that we can help them with unique issues in regards to helping out the unique communities of the Asian American and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders group. So I would absolutely be very happy if members who are listening, if they would reach out to our collaboration or Breastfeed LA or Alameda County ASAP program, reach out. I mean, we're here to help and to provide assistance.
Well, thank you again so much, Wendy Fong and Pauline Sakamoto, for taking time to participate in this panel discussion. We really appreciate having your insight and expertise regarding breastfeeding among AANHPI communities. And I also just want to say thank you to all of our attendees for listening to this live stream and really taking time to better, learn about this community and ways in which you can support this community's breastfeeding efforts. I want to do a quick reminder. Don't forget to tune in Tuesday, August 30th at 1:00 p.m. Eastern Time for our final Breastfeeding Month panel on Black breastfeeding. You can register for that live event using the QR code on your screen. Thank you.